Christian Horner's expected return to the Formula One paddock has just encountered a problem far more serious than rumours, resistance from rivals or paddock internal dynamics. What initially appeared to be a smooth and carefully planned comeback has now been disrupted by a legal and corporate barrier that very few people saw coming. According to exclusive findings published by Planet F1, Horner's pathway back into Formula One, specifically via Alpine, is being blocked not by lack of interest or money, but by a restrictive clause buried deep inside the team's ownership documents. Since being removed from his role at Red Bull shortly after the British Grand Prix last year, Horner has deliberately kept a low public profile. However, within the sport, it has been widely understood that he has never abandoned the idea of returning. Crucially, this return was never about simply taking another team principal role. After 2 decades of building Red Bull from midfield newcomers into a dominant force, Horner's ambitions have evolved. He now wants long-term influence, strategic control, and ownership, not just operational authority. That requirement immediately limits the number of realistic options available to him. Majority of top teams are either tightly controlled by manufacturers or owned by groups unwilling to dilute equity. This effectively narrowed Horner's potential landing spots to 2 organisations, Aston Martin and Alpine. Aston Martin offers infrastructure, momentum and resources, but Alpine presents something very different. An undervalued team with massive growth potential and a history of structural instability that could be transformed under the right leadership. On paper, Alpine looked like the perfect opportunity. The team has struggled competitively, suffered repeated management changes, and failed to capitalize on its resources. At the same time, Formula One's commercial boom has dramatically increased team valuations across the grid. Buying into Alpine at its lowest sporting ebb could allow Horner to replicate the Red Bull model, acquire influence early, rebuild patiently and profit both competitively and financially over time. Central to that plan is Alpine's minority shareholder, Otro Capital. In June 2023, the private equity firm purchased a 24% stake in the team for approximately €200 million, valuing Alpine at around $900 million. Since then, Formula One's explosive commercial growth has radically altered the numbers. Forbes estimated Alpine's value at roughly $2.45 billion by late 2025, meaning Otro's stake could now be worth close to $600 million, representing a return on investment of around 170% in just over 2 years. From a purely financial perspective, it would make perfect sense for Otro to sell. Private equity firms exist to generate returns, not to hold assets indefinitely. Reports have suggested that Otro has been exploring exit strategies for some time. Planet F1 understands that Horner has already secured sufficient financial backing to make such a purchase viable. Until recently, it appeared to be a matter of negotiation rather than feasibility. However, Planet F1's investigation uncovered a critical and largely overlooked complication. Alpine's corporate documents contain a clause that severely restricts when and how Otro's stake can be sold to a third party. The documents state that any sale of shares to an external buyer may only take place after a period of 3 years, following the adoption of the company's Articles of Association. Those articles were officially adopted on September 13th, 2023. This means that, regardless of interest, funding or intent, Horner cannot legally acquire Otro's stake until at least mid-September 2026. This single detail alone pushes any potential deal well beyond the immediate future, effectively freezing Horner's Alpine ambitions for the next year and a half. Even that is not the full extent of the problem. Same documents also specify that any sale of Otro's stake requires explicit approval from Renault Group, Alpine's majority owner. In addition, Renault holds a right of first refusal, meaning it has the power to match any offer made by Horner or his consortium and reclaim the shares itself. In other words, even when the 3-year lock expires, Horner still needs Renault's consent. This creates a double barrier that is both legal and internal. Horner must wait for the calendar to allow a sale, and then hope Renault chooses not to block or override the transaction. That level of uncertainty dramatically weakens his negotiating position and explains why momentum around his return has visibly slowed in recent months. This revelation also sheds light on why Horner's camp appears less urgent than earlier reports suggested. Delay is not strategic hesitation or loss of interest. It is simply reality. No amount of influence or funding can bypass legally binding corporate restrictions. The process has been paused by paperwork, not people. From Alpine's perspective, the situation is equally complex. On one hand, Horner represents an extraordinary opportunity to stabilize leadership, attract talent, and restore credibility. On the other, Renault must consider whether allowing a powerful external figure to acquire equity aligns with its long-term vision. Renault may prefer full control, or it may use Horner's interest to reassess the team's true market value. Bernie Ecclestone's involvement adds further weight to the situation. The former Formula One boss, who remains close to Horner, has reportedly advised him not to invest in Alpine. Ecclestone's concern is not emotional or personal, it is structural. Alpine's frequent leadership changes, internal dynamics, and manufacturer-driven priorities make it a risky environment for someone seeking stability and influence. Ecclestone has instead encouraged Horner to explore Aston Martin, where Lawrence Stroll has already demonstrated a willingness to trade equity for expertise. However, even that route is far from clear. Aston Martin has recently undergone its own leadership reshuffle. Adrian Newey has taken a central role, and there are concerns that Horner's arrival could complicate efforts to attract Max Verstappen in the future. What this situation ultimately exposes is that Christian Horner's biggest obstacle is not relevance, ambition, or demand, but structural access. His standing within Formula One remains untouchable. 8 drivers' championships, 6 constructors' titles, and 2 decades of competitive transformation ensure that his name still carries enormous weight. Investors listen when he speaks. Teams consider him a catalyst for growth. The interest around him has never faded. What has changed is the environment he is trying to re-enter. Formula One today is no longer a sport where influence alone opens doors. It has become a complex corporate ecosystem governed by shareholder rights, legal frameworks, and long-term commercial strategies. Ownership structures now dictate who can move, when they can move, and under what conditions. Horner is encountering a reality that did not exist when he first entered the paddock. Success on track no longer guarantees freedom off it. Timing and governance are now just as decisive as trophies. The Alpine clause uncovered by Planet F1 crystallizes this shift perfectly. It is not a technicality or a footnote. It is a decisive barrier that overrides intent, funding, and interest. Even with willing sellers, even with capital secured, and even with strategic alignment, the deal simply cannot proceed on Horner's timetable. The calendar, not ambition, is in control. And in modern Formula One, that distinction matters enormously. This also reframes Horner's recent silence in a very different light. What may appear externally as hesitation or loss of momentum is, in reality, strategic restraint. Publicly committing to a project that is legally blocked would weaken his leverage, invite scrutiny, and potentially harden resistance from key stakeholders. By staying quiet, Horner preserves optionality, keeps negotiations flexible, and avoids being forced into a reactive position. However, waiting is not without danger. Formula One moves quickly, especially in a period of regulatory change and rising valuations. Renault could decide to consolidate consolidate ownership and shut the door permanently. Market conditions could shift. Alternative opportunities may emerge and disappear. Momentum, once lost, is not always recoverable in a sport that rewards decisiveness as much as patience. This is why the roadblock facing Horner is so significant. It is not a temporary inconvenience. It is a strategic pause imposed by corporate reality. His return is no longer solely a question of where he wants to go, but when the system will allow him to move. That loss of control is perhaps the most uncomfortable aspect of the situation for someone who has spent a career shaping outcomes rather than waiting for permission. Planet F1's discovery fundamentally alters the narrative around Horner's future. This is no longer a story about ambition, rumors, or speculative links. It is a story about legal timing, shareholder consent, and corporate power. The paddock may still expect Horner to return, but it can no longer assume that return will be immediate, straightforward, or on his terms. Christian Horner's Formula One comeback remains possible, but it is now delayed, constrained, and strategically complicated. The path back is narrower than many believed, and the timing far less certain. In a sport where momentum often defines opportunity, that delay could shape the next chapter of his career as much as any decision made during his years at Red Bull. For now, Horner is not blocked by rejection or failure. He's blocked by structure, and in modern Formula One, that may be the most powerful force of all.